welcome back to my channel. I'm Traben, and in today's video, we're once again going full teacher as I talk about Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. This video, given its subject matter, is probably going to be the closest I have ever come to what it's like to sit in my classroom and hear me talk about literature, because this is not a fun book, but I do feel like it's an important book. And in much the same way, when I finished Mouse a few years ago and felt like that was at times not a pleasant reading experience and was difficult to get through and was challenging, I still feel like it was a really important book. I'm going to treat this more like a discussion of the ideas within the book and less of a review. Ta-Nehisi Coates is an American author and journalist whose work tends to center around politics, representation, very heavy topics, not things that I normally cover on this channel. And Between the World and Me is framed as a letter from him to his son about the struggles he's had as an African American growing up in America, the things he's seen, the oppression he's faced, and at all times just his rather bleak outlook on life in America. So I guess I'll start with the framing device itself. It's something that came up in our class conversations multiple times. Because of the way that this is framed, this book comes off as a very personal and very stripped back view of Coates and his outlook on life. It already has a lot of emotion to it and a lot of weight given the subject matter, but to then also frame it as a conversation between him and his son, even though it's one-sided, infuses it even more with the weight of that emotion. There are parts in here that are going to be challenging for many readers, that are going to upset people. I myself was struggling at the very beginning. I assumed, as an author and journalist, that at the very least Coates would be amenable to education and support that, but his early chapter actually rails against education, because at its core the book is really a criticism of our institutions and the failure of those institutions. And while he says that he had individual teachers that he appreciated, they were still stuck in a system that, to Coates' view, was either designed to make him compliant or to put him back on the streets where he felt like he was going to die. And that's a very bleak outlook on the education system. And as a teacher, that was very tough for me to read. And, I think that it's good to be challenged sometimes in your reading and to understand that having your beliefs challenged or having your ideas pushed back against is not a bad thing. There's a quote from John Green when he was talking about the banning of one of his books, and he ended his video talking about the book bans by saying something to the effect of, if your worldview can be impacted by a book, then I submit to you that the book is not the problem, right? So if your ideas can't survive getting challenged by something someone is saying in a book, then maybe your ideals are not very strong. Your beliefs are not held as strongly as you would like them to be. And what I will say, getting further into the book, one of the things I admire most about this book is Coates' ability to put himself in the mindset of himself at the time that he's writing. Because as he's writing this book, in reality, it's, much farther along in his life. He's writing to his 15-year-old son. And so he's already experienced everything he's going to talk about throughout the entirety of the book, but he's going back to that moment in his childhood, and he's presenting his viewpoint in that moment and his frustrations and his fear. And he does so in a way that, initially my thought was, okay, this is his outlook on education. That's a really depressing outlook. That's a really negative view of the world. But as the book gets further along, you see that part of the purpose of the book is his change in his outlook. There is a running metaphor, an extended metaphor throughout the book of places that he cannot reach, whether they be countries or aspects of society, different realms, different places he can't go. He talks about them as if they're other planets, right? So when he's young, he's saying, what's the purpose of learning a foreign language or learning French? I was never going to get to that planet. That was a billion miles away. That was a completely different solar system. I was never going to get there. And then later, he talks about actually going to France and how he was frustrated looking back that he didn't see the value of what he was being taught, and that these things were an opportunity to open up those worlds for him. And so I think one of the things that people are going to grab onto with this book is the anger, the frustration, the bleak outlook on life that he portrays. As you get further and further in the book, that concept gets more and more refined to where it gets to the point, his viewpoint as of now. And I think just in the process of seeing how he's changed from his time as a high school student to now, you can understand that he's still in the process of changing. So again, the core concept here is the failure of our institutions, the concept that as a capitalist society that initially built its wealth off the back of slave labor, we still need an exploitable group of people to continue to perpetuate the system that we're building. So he talks a lot about black bodies. He uses very interesting diction as he's talking. So he reminds his son over and over again about how he knows that his son's body can be destroyed. And we talked about in my class how that's a very interesting word to use, destroyed, instead of killed or murdered, which is what we would normally associate with taking someone's life. And we talked about how it could be a couple of different things. One really brilliant observation from one of my students was that if they had used those other terms, it wouldn't stand out as much. It wouldn't be as much of an impact because we've been desensitized to those terms. We've been desensitized to that idea. And as you get further into the book, it does seem like this is tying into the concept of black bodies, African Americans, as a resource that was used to initially start up the country, and now as an exploitable resource for society, the have-nots, right? We have to have the haves and the have-nots, and I think by using destroyed, which is something you'd use more for inanimate objects like a building or something like that, it strengthens that concept of African Americans as a resource, as something that is being used and being exploited, which again is part of the core argument being made here. Early in chapter 1, I think the main thesis, the thing that we came back to many times in group conversation, was there's a line that says, race is not the father of racism, but its son, which is to say that we did not create racism because there were different races. There are no inherent qualities. Skin tones are different, and there's definitely, physical differences among people, but the assigning of qualities to those groups came about because of racism, not the other way around. So racism existed, prejudice existed, and so we put on to others this delineation of, if you're in this group, then you are, a lesser person, and if you're in this group, you're a better person. And that, again, I think feels the core of his argument. A couple other things I wanted to mention in here, just talking about like the progression of his idea and his outlook. He talks about his time in college and how he was striving for answering these questions that he had about, his heritage and his community, and talking about this question of who is the Tolstoy of the Zulus. And he goes and does all this research about these different tribes and who were their famous artists. He started, consuming all this art from that culture, and he came up with, a couple of high profile individuals that he would hold up as he would hold up as the Tolstoy of that society. He talks about idolizing this queen who, when she was refused a seat in this meeting, she had one of her servants, crouch down, and she sat on his back to kind of like flex her power and her influence. But then he meets a professor that pushes back on these ideas and pushes back on this idolization that he has. And we see a bit of his thought process of growing and changing his outlook. So this professor argues that his premise is faulty. Tolstoy is the Tolstoy of other societies, of other groups, unless you want to put some sort of artificial barrier on art, as though Tolstoy was only meant for a certain group of people. He was falling into the trap of your society has to have, or your culture has to have, someone who is at this level or doing these things, and that's not the case. He also reflects back on the empress that he was thinking about, and reflecting on how he was probably, as just an everyman, closer to the person that she forced to sit and be her chair than to the queen herself. And so he talks about how there is this tendency in all societies to have those in power, those without power. He also reflects on his own prejudices, which tended to be against homosexuals, LGBTQ plus people, and how he would call them names because they were a group that he could basically punch down on. They were a smaller subset, a weaker group than him, and so he had the ability to exercise that social power over them. And so, obviously, we're dealing with a lot of heavy themes. We're dealing with a lot of heavy ideas. I feel like at the very least, reading this book gave me that firsthand account, that perspective from somebody who has had these thoughts and had this experience his entire life that's completely alien from my own. And really, I feel like that's the core of the entire reason why we read books, is so that we can experience different lives and experience different outlooks. I read a lot of fantasy because I want to see new worlds and I want to see, the new magic system and, see these characters go through these struggles and go through these epic, these epic showdowns, change and grow and learn something. And it was a very big departure from that to read Between the World and Me. But at its core, it's still looking at the real world and an experience that I'm completely divested from, that I have no firsthand knowledge of or experience of. And so I think it was really good and important to read this book. Another thing that I found really interesting with the book is Coates and his discussion of religion. Multiple times throughout the book, he talks about how he is not a member of any church community. He doesn't have any belief in a god or a supernatural being or anything like that, and how he can only see and trust that people are going to do better, that people are going to change. He has to put his faith in others. And there are parts of the book where he talks about faith in a way that is very interesting. I find a lot of atheists fairly dismissive of faith and of those who have a belief in a higher power or higher being. But Coates talks about it in a way that he's almost jealous that people have this faith. He talks about how people are shielded by their faith, whether or not he does not believe it's real, but their conviction, they believe it's real. Their conviction's real. And so he looks at that, and there are times where he talks about how he wishes he had that, but he just can't. He can't bring himself to believe that there is this higher power. Some other key things that I found very interesting. He talks about how his father hit him, and he's talking to his son, speaking about his father beating him with a belt, and he talks about how his understanding now is that his father did it because he loved him and he wanted him to realize that that it was either his father beats him or the police beat him or society gets him. And that was a really hard thing to read. I think that was a tough bit for a bunch of my students as well. This was not a comfortable book. This was not a fun read, as I alluded to earlier. And like I said, just like with Mouse, it was not... I didn't have a good time with this, but I think it was really important that I read it. I feel like there are times when we need to read something that challenges us, that pushes us to see the world in new ways and to think about different things. And just like I tell my students, I'm not particularly interested in their opinions of what's being said, because we can't get into that kind of debate within class. We are talking about the way that he forms his argument, and at least recognizing that he believes all these things to be true, that he has this conviction that there are serious problems with society, with our systems, with our institutions. Here's the evidence he's presenting. And some of my students rightly pointed out, a lot of it is emotion-based. A lot of it is anecdotal, and it's not supporting it with, facts and figures. But I countered with, but facts and figures wouldn't have served its purpose. Its purpose is not to convince a general audience that he's right or that his worldview is correct. Its purpose is to show his son, and by virtue of him publishing it, to show others, other young black men, the experiences that he's had, the lessons he's learned, And ultimately, I think his goal as a father or a father figure is to give his son, to give young men this knowledge that he has, this all this thinking and learning and observations he's had over the course of his life, so that they can start maybe a little bit farther, and so they can do more than he's done. And I think that's really the wish of every parent, is to give their kids the tools to do a little bit better. Would I recommend that you read Between the World and Me? I don't know. I think that it's very challenging. I think that it is very blunt. The word choice is purposefully meant to incense certain groups of people, and I think that would be a very difficult thing for a lot of people to read. However, do I think it's important? Yes. Am I glad that I read through this book? Yes. I just like I was saying, I think it's important to build empathy, to build perspective. You have to read things that are going to push against your worldview, to push against your beliefs, and hopefully you come out of the other side not changed, but with that new understanding in mind, to take it, incorporate it into your own understanding of the world and your own viewpoint, and hopefully have just a slightly better picture of the world so that you can do maybe a little bit better. Yeah. Well, I know that was a lot. I hope your reading journey is going well. I hope you are reading things that make you think, and you are reading things that maybe challenge you a little bit. And as always, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, help us grow this corner of our BookTube community. And until the next time, take care.